Will you help me welcome to the stage Laura Zabel from St. Paul and Fergus Falls from Springboard for the Arts. Give her a round of applause. Come on, 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 come on.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Come on, you're in church. Good afternoon. It is so wonderful to be here with you today. I'm so excited to be in Mitchell and to be a part of RuralX and to be with all of you, and really looking forward to learning about the work that all of you are doing in your own community so that I can selfishly take back those ideas to my own work. My name is Laura Zabel. I'm the executive director of an organization called Springboard for the Arts. Springboard is based in Minnesota, and Minnesota was and is home to the Dakota and a lot of other Native people. So when our work starts with place, it always starts there. Springboard is an organization that's built by and for artists. So we have a staff of 20 practicing artists that do our programs, and we're based both in the urban area of the Twin Cities and in a rural community called Fergus Falls. And our work is all about building reciprocal relationships between artists and their communities. We do direct services to help artists as entrepreneurs, business skills training, healthcare, other kinds of really nuts and bolts practical things to help artists make a living and a life. And we also do programs that help communities tap into the power that artists can provide and think more creatively about the big issues in those communities and in those places. Our work really starts with these two foundational ideas. The first is a really broad definition of what art is, that art is about meaning making in everyday life. So think about the ways that you make meaning in your everyday life. That's art. And this means that we also have a really broad definition of who artists are and who get to claim that label of artist. And maybe people who might challenge your idea of what art is. And people who have very successful, very professional careers as artists, and people who maybe never show their artwork to anyone, or for whom that is a personal practice just in their family or just in their community. That includes tradition bearers, culture bearers, and other kinds of creative makers. The other really foundational idea for us is that we make community by doing things together. We don't make community by talking. We make community by doing, by creating shared experience and a sense of belonging. Think about the ways that you feel that sense of belonging in your own community. It's because you have shared experience with those other people, because you did something or made something together. We think we may have found the last apolitical idea in the world. And it is this, that everyone wants to live in a healthy community, right? You would be hard-pressed to find someone who says that they wish to live in an unhealthy community. And even our idea of what constitutes a healthy community is pretty similar. We pretty much agree on some basic building block things, like we want to live someplace that's safe. We want to have good access to education, to jobs, and to green space, that we want to be able to connect with our family and friends, that we want to live in a place that looks nice and has things to do that make us feel that sense of belonging and connection. But the other thing that we can also probably agree on is that not everyone lives in a healthy community, or not every community is healthy for all the people who live there. That's because we have things like racial and gender inequality baked in to our systems. And because we're facing big, huge challenges, things like climate change and wealth inequality. And it's also because people outside of our communities are creating the stories and the narratives, things like the rural-urban divide. These are stories that other people are telling about us that further push us apart instead of bring us together. So if we agree that not all communities are healthy, or not all communities are healthy for everyone who lives there, then what needs to change? It seems pretty clear that what got us here to the place we're in is not going to get us where we need to go. That our traditional approaches, as Joe was referencing earlier, to economic and community development, traditional approaches that treat communities like machines with parts that can be optimized, with sectors that are siloed, with different components of a community that don't talk to each other, and systems that treat the people who are most affected by those big challenges as victims or as pawns or are just ignoring them, those approaches are part of the problem. Similarly, approaches that treat art and culture as a thing you do when you get dressed up and go out and do it once in a while, that treat artists as people who aren't from here, who must be from someplace else, or who leave art as the domain of the coasts, those approaches are also part of the problem. We think part of the solution is already in our community already. We look to our friends in community organizing who know really deeply how to center people, that in order to make change in any place, in any community, you have to start with the people who are there. They are the experts in both the challenges and the assets of their place. And that by trusting people, by building the power and agency of people who are in those places already, that's where change starts. But sometimes our friends in community development and community organizing don't recognize that how you build power and agency has to start with culture. It has to start with our identities. It has to start with meaning making and belonging, and that's art. On the other side, we think folks in arts and culture, there's a really great body of knowledge about how arts and culture contributes to economic development, how arts and culture can drive spending and investment in communities. But a lot of times, that side of things doesn't focus on individual people and on the creativity and culture that lives in each of us. We continue to kind of perseverate this idea that it is about big institutions or that you have to go somewhere to find culture, that it isn't already in you, in your house. So what we're interested in is how we might take the best of both of those pieces of our communities and combine them. And we like to think about that as something we call creative people power. And that creative people power is a natural resource. It's an energy source that exists in every one of our communities already. That's the really good news, is that we all have access to creative people power already. It's on every neighborhood, on every block, in every place, because every community has creative people. Every community has artists. I like to think about this idea of creative people power as a renewable energy source, because then you can make the comparison to other renewable energy sources. All of our communities have sun, they have wind. That exists already. But in order to access that energy, we have to build the systems that help us plug in, that help us tend to those natural resources and make sure they're healthy. So that's what I like to say about Springboard's work. We're an ecosystem organization. We're building the solar panels. The sun exists. We're just building the panels to help us plug in, to help us connect with the people, the creative people that are already in our midst, that are already in this audience, and that are ready to bring their creative thinking and creative skills to some of our community's biggest challenges. What does that look like in practice, for real? About 8 years ago, Springboard opened an office in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, population 13,000. Before that, we had been primarily an urban organization that did what urban organizations do, which is believe that they are the center of the world and import their programs out into other communities and feel very good about themselves. Someone invited us to open an office in Fergus Falls, and even then we thought, yes, this is a satellite office of our main urban office. But we learned pretty quickly, mostly because I had incredible teachers who we hired to run the work in Fergus Falls, that it wasn't a situation of a main office and a satellite, that we had found our missing half. That we had been walking around as an organization missing a whole half of our work. And that was what this work looked like in a rural context. So now we talk about Springboard as one organization that's based in both the Twin Cities and in Fergus Falls. And from both those contexts, we learn from each other, we build exchange, we build solidarity across those urban-rural contexts. And we do things differently in both places. We do some things the same, and then our work looks different because context and community is different. And in Fergus Falls, one of the things that's different is that they have a historic state mental hospital that's been vacant for about 15 years. It's a beautiful building. It's 750,000 square feet of vacant space in a community of 13,000 people. Your community may not have a vacant state mental hospital, but it probably has some vacant buildings. It probably has some spaces that really push people's buttons and that really are frustrating big, seemingly insurmountable challenges. And that's the case with this building in Fergus Falls. Most of the conversation is, we have to tear it down, we can't tear it down. these being the only two options and always in opposition to each other. So about 8 years ago, my colleague Naomi Schliessman, who's an amazing artist who lives, born and bred in Fergus Falls, asked a different question. What else is possible? What if it's not, we have to tear it down, we can't tear it down? What else is possible? She made a chalkboard silhouette of that building, and we put it up in our office and invited people to write on it. And this tiny, tiny project, it's just a chalkboard compared to the scale of an enormous building. This tiny project took on a life of its own. People were writing on the chalkboard. People carried this chalkboard in a parade. It was installed in all kinds of different locations in Fergus Falls, and it started this tiny spark of a different conversation, a conversation that was about the future and was about possibility. And it also helped us understand that there were creative people in this community who had ideas about what to do or had ideas about how to help a community move forward. So over the last 8 years, we've worked with hundreds of artists in Fergus Falls and in the region to design projects that help people come together and have a different conversation about this big community challenge, including a play that was co-created with about 50 community members that 600 people from Fergus Falls came to and rode their bikes from scene to scene all the way around the perimeter of that building. We also started an artist residency program in the former nurses' dormitory on the grounds of that state mental hospital. So artists were the first people to live back on those grounds since the building closed, and were part of this initial spark of redevelopment of some of the external buildings. And what we discovered once we started doing these projects is that there was a whole hidden issue in this big community issue that we thought, that everyone thought, was about the building. What I learned from artists and from this idea of creative people power and these small projects that started illuminating new conversations is that before we can talk about what happens to the building, we have to talk about the role that mental health treatment has played in the culture of this community for 100 years. And I think that is a lesson we can take and extrapolate to other communities. When we're trying to make a community help a community make a big change, when we're trying to help people move forward in a new way, people need to be able to talk about their pain, their shame, their joy, their pride. Then we can talk about what to do with the building. We also started a special residency program in Fergus Falls called the Homecoming Residency. Doing all these small projects started attracting people back to their home community, and we started seeing young people come back and find places to plug in. So we have a residency program called the Homecoming Residency that's only open to people who grew up in that region. So artists who grew up in and around Fergus Falls, who've gone away to other places, can come back for between 2 and 12 weeks to share what they've learned being out in the world in other places, and to also see their community with new eyes. Because I think one of the opportunities that we have in rural places, and this is also true in underinvested urban neighborhoods, is that our young people do come back. And sometimes they come back for really hard reasons. They've gone away to college, they've had lives, and they come back sometimes because there's a health crisis in their family, or because they're having an employment crisis, or their family business needs support. And we have the opportunity to make sure that when they do come back, that's a celebration and not a failure. And that there are places for them to plug in, there are places for them to find their own leadership and their own voice, and maybe they'll stay. That's why we stay. We don't stay because we came back because we had to. We stay because we find joy, we find community, we find meaning making. So this homecoming residency isn't about getting all of these people to move back. That's not a one-to-one outcome. But it is about building these relationships and seeing our community as broader than just the geographic confines of the town. We also started supporting artists to work in partnership in and around the city to help people imagine these new futures and try out new ideas more quickly. I think all of us understand what it feels like to get bogged down in planning, and sometimes we sit around and talk about the planning forever before we get to the doing. And artists are really good at getting to the doing. Last summer, there was a big community-wide conversation about reorienting some development towards the riverfront in Fergus Falls, and that was gonna take up a bunch of parking. It would meant the downtown would lose parking. And we all know that's very challenging for people. Parking is important. So we said, well, let's just test out the idea. So we supported a group of artists who rented 3 parking spaces in downtown Fergus Falls and turned them into a park, all in one summer. This was called the People's Park, and people from all over the community came here to eat their lunch, to connect with each other, to make meaning, to build belonging, and to actually experience what it would be like to have a park, to have green space in their downtown that was oriented towards the river. So we didn't have to wait till the end of the plan and not do all the construction to test it out. We could actually try it in real time. Artists are also really good at building from what exists already and seeing those hidden assets. Part of the story we need to tell about our community is all the things that already work, all the things that are already great about our places, even winter. This was a film screening and outdoor movie night in the middle of frozen Lake Alice in Fergus Falls. We also served popsicles. Artists are also really good at helping us understand the process to undo big community challenges, whether that's literal or more metaphoric. And this is a project that does both. This is a brand new project that we commissioned from 2 artists in partnership with West Central Initiative. It's called Paper Planes. It's a mobile paper making station. And these 2 artists gather invasive species, invasive plants, and they grind them up into pulp, and then they help people make paper from that pulp. And in that new paper are embedded the seeds of native plants. So you can take that paper home and plant it in your garden and literally turn invasive species into the things that are meant to grow in your community. And that works on a small scale because it's actually completing that cycle of turning something that's a big community challenge into literally planting what we want to see grow. But it also works as a metaphor for how we think about turning big challenges into assets, how we think about regenerative economies, regenerative communities, and building new systems. All of this work in Fergus Falls has attracted a fair amount of attention. This is the front page of the Sunday Star Tribune. It's only slightly under how important parking is to the city of Minneapolis. So we're still, some things will always be the top headline. But in addition to this article, Fergus Falls has been in the New York Times, on all kinds of international media outlets, and a lot of that coverage has been related to how young people are coming back because of these cultural opportunities, because they see there's a place for them to belong and make meaning with their neighbors, with their friends, their families. Those are people who grew up there and also newcomers, the kinds of people that we're all trying to connect and support and make sure that people can find a place in our communities. Lest you think Fergus Falls is super special, which it is, but it doesn't mean that these ideas can't work other places. We've taken this kind of process and been able to help other communities use these tools. This is a project in Oklahoma that came out of a similar process that was about supporting local artists to solve big community challenges. And they had a big challenge in their downtown area that when it rained, no one went to any of the shops. So they put these poems on the sidewalk that only appear when it rains. So now there's a reason for people to visit and patronize those local businesses. We're also in the middle of a big project called Artists on Main Street that's taking place in southern Minnesota and communities all across southern Minnesota, really supporting artists that are from communities that are newer, the cultures that are newer to those communities, to make sure that they also have the opportunity to share their story, to share their culture, to share their history, and provide those points of a connection and meaning making. And we kind of have this little formula for how we think you generate creative people power. There's just 3 key principles. The first is that these relationships have to be reciprocal. There have to be mechanisms that help us build relationships across those silos, across those sectors. And this is something we're particularly good at in rural communities already because we all already wear multiple hats all the time. So why not use that as an asset? And how do we build these relationships that really are mutually beneficial? It has to be asset-based. You start with what you already have. You start with the material that's already there. You find the hidden assets. You put a spotlight on those. And it has to be equity-driven. This is about more than just saying it's a big table, anyone's invited. It's about really getting to the root and addressing the historic and systemic inequities in our communities. And then you need these 4 building blocks. We think you need a hub and home for creative ideas. Think about your own community. Where's the place where people go to get connected to what else is going on, to get connected to resources, to find out who else they should be talking to about a big issue? It might be a downtown storefront like our office in Fergus Falls, but it might also be your public library, it might be a cafe, or it might be a person. We also believe a lot in lots of little, that you have to plant a lot of seeds to get a beautiful garden to grow. So start small. that artists need to be invited to the table. We need to bring creative thinking to all the tables, not just asking artists to decorate things after they're done, but to really come to the table with those questions like what else is possible. And that artists have to be supported to make a living and a life. This means we have to pay artists for their time and their creativity and their thinking. And if we do those things, if we use these principles, we build these blocks, we tap into our creative people power that exists already. Oops, I'll talk about that later. Creative people power can help teach our systems to value meaning making, to value shared experience and human connection. And creative people power is what will help us build what's next by asking, what else is possible? Thank you.